You think you know what life was like for a medieval monk. You picture peaceful stone corridors echoing with gentle chants, brothers gliding silently through candle-lit halls in pristine robes, their days filled with quiet prayer and scholarly pursuits. You imagine a sanctuary of order and tranquility, a world where the chaos of medieval life is kept at bay by thick walls and sacred rituals. But tonight you're about to discover how catastrophically wrong that romanticized image truly is. You step through the heavy oak doors of the monastery for the first time, and the reality hits you like a physical blow. The air isn't filled with the sweet scent of incense and parchment you expected. Instead, your nostrils are assaulted by a nauseating cocktail of unwashed bodies, damp wool, human waste, and something else. Something that makes your stomach turn. It's the unmistakable stench of lice, infested clothing and flesh that hasn't seen soap in months. The silence isn't peaceful meditation. It's the oppressive quiet of men too exhausted, too broken, or too terrified to speak. Your scalp still burns from the tonsure ceremony, that holy ritual where they scraped away your hair with a dull blade, leaving a raw, weeping circle of exposed skin. The other monks called it your crown of thorns, but it feels more like a brand marking you as property of the church. You touch the tender wound gingerly, feeling the crusted blood and knowing that this is just the beginning of your transformation from human being to vessel of obedience. The dormitory stretches before you, rows of straw pallets that are barely softer than the stone floor beneath them. Each bed is identical, each monk's possessions non-existent. You're told this is humility, but it feels like erasure. The brother next to you scratches constantly at something crawling beneath his habit, and you realize with growing horror that you'll soon be doing the same. The lice here aren't just tolerated, they're celebrated as God's pearls, a sign of holy devotion to suffering. You try to focus on the prayers being chanted around you, but your mind reels with the contradictions. This place that promised spiritual elevation feels more like systematic degradation. The abbot speaks of salvation through suffering, but you're beginning to suspect that the suffering might be the point, not a path to something greater, but the destination itself. The bell tolls for matins, and you realize it's midnight. You've been here less than 12 hours, and already your old life feels like a distant dream. As you shuffle toward the chapel with the other hollow-eyed brothers, their faces gaunt from inadequate food and their bodies bent from constant labor, you understand the first terrible truth of monastic life. This isn't about finding God. This is about discovering how much a human being can endure before they break completely. You think about the modern world, where comfort is expected and suffering is avoided at all costs. You wonder how many people today could last even a single day in this place, not just the physical hardships, but the psychological assault of having every trace of individuality systematically stripped away. You wonder if anyone would choose this life if they truly understood what it meant. The other monks file past you like ghosts, their movements mechanical, their eyes vacant. Some have been here for decades, and you can see what the years have done to them. They've achieved something, certainly, but is it holiness, or just the complete surrender of self? As you take your place among them, you realize that you're about to find out which one you'll become. You kneel on the cold stone, feeling the chill seep through your thin habit, and whisper your first prayer as a monk. But it's not a prayer of gratitude or devotion. It's a prayer for strength, not to serve God, but simply to survive what you've gotten yourself into, because you're beginning to understand that the real test of faith isn't belief, it's endurance. You wake to the sound of the midnight bell, your scalp still throbbing from yesterday's tonsure, but there's something else, an incessant, maddening itch that seems to crawl across every inch of your freshly shaved head. You reach up instinctively to scratch, and your fingers come away with something small, dark, and very much alive. Welcome to your first encounter with what the brothers cheerfully call God's pearls, the lice that will become your constant, unwelcome companions for the rest of your monastic life. You thought the worst part of joining the monastery would be the cold, the hunger, or the endless prayers. You never imagined it would be the realization that you're now sharing your body with an army of parasites that the Church has somehow managed to rebrand as a blessing. The older monks speak of their lice with an almost fond reverence, as if these blood-sucking creatures are tiny martyrs helping them achieve holiness through constant itching torment. Brother Thomas, who's been here for 15 years, catches you scratching and offers what he considers comfort. The more you suffer in this life, the less you'll suffer in the next. His own scalp is a landscape of red welts and scabs, evidence of years of cohabitation with his pearls. You watch in horrified fascination as he casually picks a particularly fat louse from behind his ear and crushes it between his fingernails with the same reverence another man might show handling a rosary bead. The reality hits you like a physical blow. This isn't just about you anymore. The entire monastery is crawling, literally crawling with these creatures. They live in the straw of your palate, in the wool of your habit, in the very air you breathe. You learn that even the most revered churchmen in history were infested. Archbishop Thomas Becket, that paragon of holiness, was so covered in lice that when they removed his hair shirt after his martyrdom, witnesses described the vermin as boiling over like water in a simmering cauldron. You try to understand the twisted logic that transforms this nightmare into virtue. The monks explain that cleanliness is vanity, that washing too frequently shows pride in your physical form rather than focus on your spiritual development. The stench that rises from unwashed bodies, what they call the odor of sanctity, is supposedly proof of your dedication to mortifying the flesh. You wonder how many people in the modern world would last even a day with this medieval interpretation of personal hygiene. The scratching becomes a constant background noise in the monastery, like a perverse form of percussion accompanying the prayers. You watch the other monks during services, their hands moving unconsciously to scratch at necks, scalps, and hidden places beneath their robes. Some have developed a technique of scratching while appearing to pray, their fingers working frantically at their infested skin while their lips move in silent devotion. Historians debate whether this acceptance of parasites was truly about spiritual discipline or simply the result of medical ignorance and limited resources. You feel both explanations in your bones, the genuine belief that suffering brings you closer to God, and the practical reality that with 40 monks sharing cramped quarters and bathing only 4 times a year, lice are simply inevitable. But knowing the reasons doesn't make the constant itching any less maddening. You think about Bishop Thomas Cantilupe, whose lice had to be scooped off by the handful during his final illness. You imagine the Dominican mystic Henry Suso, who wore a hair shirt embedded with brass nails and still managed to accumulate enough lice to be considered especially holy. These weren't failures of hygiene, they were badges of honor, proof of commitment to a life of deliberate suffering. The nights are the worst. Lying on your straw pallet in the dark, you can feel them moving tiny legs picking their way across your skin, finding new places to bite, to feed, to multiply. You learn to sleep despite the constant irritation, or perhaps because of exhaustion so complete that even lice can't keep you awake. You wonder if this is what they mean by dying to the world. Not a spiritual metaphor, but a literal description of what happens when you stop caring about basic human comfort. As dawn approaches and the bell prepares to ring for lauds, you realize that you're already changing. The revulsion is fading, replaced by a grim acceptance that feels disturbingly like the first step towards something you're not sure you want to become. You're learning to endure not just the lice, but the transformation of your very understanding of what it means to be human. But if you think sharing your body with parasites is the worst indignity the monastery has to offer, wait until you discover what happens when 40 constipated monks share a 2-story privy. You stand in the cold stone chamber, surrounded by the other novices, waiting your turn for what the brothers euphemistically call receiving the crown. The abbot's razor gleams in the flickering candlelight, still wet with blood from the previous victim, because that's what you are really, victims of a ritual that transforms human beings into branded property of the church. The tonsure isn't just a haircut. It's a public declaration that your individual identity is being systematically erased, one scrape of the blade at a time. When your turn comes, you kneel on the unforgiving stone, feeling the cold seep through your thin novice robes. The abbot's hands are surprisingly rough as they grip your head, positioning it for the blade. You've heard the older monks joke about tonsophobia, the fear of haircuts, but this isn't fear of a simple trim. This is terror at watching yourself disappear, literally and figuratively, as tufts of your hair fall to the floor like pieces of your former self. The first scrape of the razor is a shock, not just the cold metal against your scalp, but the realization that there's no going back. Each pass of the blade removes another layer of who you were, leaving behind raw, bleeding skin that will mark you as church property for the rest of your life. The other monks watch with expressions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed amusement, remembering their own initiation into this brotherhood of the shorn. The pain is immediate and lasting. The medieval razor isn't the precision instrument you might imagine. It's more like a dull knife scraping away everything in its path. Your scalp burns, bleeds, and throbs as the crown of thorns takes shape. This circular patch of raw skin will become your most visible badge of submission, a permanent reminder that you've surrendered not just your comfort, but your very appearance to the will of others. You think about the modern world where hair is a symbol of identity, rebellion, even power. Here it's the opposite. The less you have, the more you supposedly belong to God. But as you feel the blood trickling down your neck, you wonder if this ritual is really about divine devotion or simply about breaking your spirit through public humiliation. The watching monks seem to enjoy the spectacle a little too much for it to be purely spiritual. The psychological impact is perhaps worse than the physical pain. As you catch your reflection in a dark window, a stranger stares back, marked, branded, diminished. The tonsure creates an instant hierarchy. Those who have endured it, and those who haven't, those whose scars have healed, and those whose wounds are still fresh. You realize that this isn't just about joining a religious community. It's about submitting to a system that requires the complete erasure of self. Historians debate the true origins and purpose of the tonsure. Some trace it back to the 2nd century, claiming it symbolizes the crown of thorns worn by Christ. Others argue it's a practical method of identification and control, ensuring that monks can't easily blend back into secular society. You feel both explanations in your bones, the genuine belief that suffering brings you closer to God, and the cold calculation of an institution that knows how to break people systematically. The ritual is deliberately public, and that's the point. Every monk in the monastery watches as you're transformed from individual to vessel, from person to property. Some remember their own ordeal with sympathy. Others seem to take satisfaction in watching someone else endure what they survived. You sense that this shared trauma creates a strange bond among the brothers, but also a hierarchy based on how well you can endure humiliation without breaking. As the abbot finishes his work, you feel every eye in the room on your bleeding scalp. The cold air bites at the exposed skin, and you shiver, pulling your robe tighter around your shoulders. That night, lying on your straw pallet, every movement sends jolts of pain across your head. The other novices whisper jokes, welcome to the brotherhood of the bald, but the humor feels forced, a desperate attempt to make light of something that has fundamentally changed you. You learn to sleep despite the constant throbbing, to ignore the way people stare at your raw, healing scalp, to accept that this mark will define you for the rest of your life. The tonsure becomes a test of endurance that never really ends, not just the physical pain, but the psychological adjustment to being marked, branded, set apart from the world you once knew. But if you think the tonsure is the worst humiliation the monastery has to offer, wait until you discover what happens when you're trapped in a scriptorium with the demon Titivillus counting every mistake you make. You shuffle into the scriptorium before dawn, your breath visible in the frigid air, fingers already stiff and aching from the bone, deep cold that never seems to leave this place. The stone walls trap the faint scent of ink, wax, and worn parchment, creating an atmosphere so thick with scholarly suffering that you can almost taste the desperation of generations of monks who have bent over these same desks. You take your place at a long wooden table, if you're lucky enough to have one, since many monasteries still force scribes to balance their work on their laps like some medieval form of torture. Your task seems deceptively simple. Copy the sacred texts, letter by painstaking letter, with absolutely no room for error. The parchment is precious beyond measure, the ink painstakingly mixed from ingredients that cost more than a peasant's yearly income, and every single mistake isn't just a professional embarrassment, it's a mark against your immortal soul. You dip your quill, watching the ink tremble at the tip like your own nervous hands, and begin the daily battle against perfection that will define your existence here. But it isn't just human scrutiny you fear as you work in this dimly lit chamber. Somewhere in the shadows of your mind, and according to the older monks literally hovering over your shoulder, lurks the demon Titivillus, that malicious imp whose sole purpose is to collect every slip, every blot, every misspelled word you produce. The theologian John of Galensis wrote in 1285 that this creature collected into his sack 1,000 errors made by monks every day, and you can almost feel his invisible presence as your hand trembles over each letter. You glance at the margins of ancient manuscripts around you, where generations of desperate scribes have left their own testimonies to this torment. "I'm so cold my fingers are trembling," reads one pitiful note. "Oh, my hand hurts so much," pleads another. Writing is incredibly tedious. It bends your back, dims your sight, and twists your stomach and sides. One particularly honest monk, finishing his labors, scrawled, "Finally I've written it all. For Christ's sake, pour me a drink." The hours crawl by with excruciating slowness. Your back develops a permanent ache from hunching over your work. Your eyes burn from straining in the inadequate candlelight, and your fingers cramp into claw, like shapes that barely respond to your commands. The single candle gutters lower, threatening to plunge you into darkness and ruin hours of painstaking work. You learn to write by feel as much as sight, developing an almost supernatural awareness of every stroke and curve. The pressure is relentless and multifaceted. Not only must you produce flawless copies, but you're racing against time. It typically takes a full year to copy a standard Bible, and every day lost to mistakes or illness extends your sentence in this scholarly purgatory. You begin to understand why some monks developed what we might now recognize as obsessive-compulsive behaviors, checking and rechecking every letter, every line, every margin until their eyes bled from the strain. You think about the modern world, where mistakes can be deleted with a keystroke, where spell check catches errors before they become permanent, where the pressure to be perfect doesn't carry the weight of eternal damnation. Here, one slip of the quill could mean scraping away hours of work with a sharp knife, or worse, accepting that your error will be preserved forever in holy text, a permanent testament to your fallibility that Titivillus will gleefully add to his collection. The psychological warfare is perhaps worse than the physical discomfort. Every monk in the Scriptorium knows about Titivillus, and the shared paranoia creates an atmosphere of barely controlled terror. You catch yourself glancing over your shoulder, certain you can hear the rustle of demonic wings or the scratch of claws on parchment. Sleep becomes elusive as you lie awake replaying every letter you wrote, wondering if that last E was properly formed or if you've just handed another victory to the forces of darkness. Historians debate whether the legend of Titivillus was a genuine belief or a psychological tool used by monastic authorities to maintain quality control through fear. You feel both possibilities in your bones, the genuine terror of supernatural judgment and the very human understanding that this myth serves to keep scribes focused and compliant. Either way, the result is the same, a level of stress and anxiety that would be familiar to any modern worker facing impossible standards and constant surveillance. As the bell tolls for the next prayer service, you set down your quill with trembling fingers, flexing hands that feel permanently cramped into writing position. You glance at your day's work, pages that represent hours of agony, covered in letters that must be perfect enough to escape both human criticism and demonic collection. Tomorrow will bring more pages, more pressure, more opportunities for Titivillus to claim his prize. But if you think the terror of making mistakes while copying holy texts is the worst suffering the monastery has to offer, Wait until you discover what happens when 40 constipated monks share a 2-story privy, and someone has to wake up the brothers who fall asleep on the toilet. You thought the lice were bad, you thought the tonsure was humiliating, you thought the scriptorium was torture, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared you for the digestive nightmare that defines daily life in this monastery. Welcome to what the brothers euphemistically call the trials of the flesh. But what you're beginning to understand is simply the inevitable result of cramming 40 men into cramped quarters with a diet that would challenge even the strongest constitution. The problem starts with the food, or rather, the complete lack of understanding about what constitutes a healthy diet. Before 1336, Pope Benedict Roman XII's revolutionary decision to allow clergy to eat 4-legged animals, the monastic diet was already a recipe for digestive disaster. Even now, with the addition of lamb, beef, pork, and venison, the fundamental issue remains. You eat only once a day, or twice in summer if you're lucky. There's simply no time for proper meals between the endless cycle of prayers, work, and more prayers. You learn quickly that bigger portions doesn't mean better digestion. In fact, it means the opposite. When you're cramming an entire day's worth of food into 1 or 2 massive meals, your body rebels in ways that would be familiar to any modern person who's ever attempted an extreme eating challenge. Except this isn't a challenge, this is your life every single day for the rest of your monastic career. The monastery's solution to this crisis is both ingenious and horrifying. A separate 2-story building that serves as an enormous privy, specifically designed to accommodate the 40 constipated monks of Muchelney Abbey. You stare at this architectural marvel, if you can call it that, and realize that someone actually had to sit down and calculate the precise number of toilet stalls needed for a community of chronically blocked brothers. The upper floor is connected to the lower by a system that would make modern sewage engineers weep with either admiration or horror. But the real nightmare isn't the building itself, it's what happens inside it. You discover that monks regularly fall asleep on the toilets, exhausted from straining against their rebellious digestive systems. This creates a new job category, the Circator, whose official duties include walking the monastery at night to ensure no ungodly mischief is taking place, but whose unofficial responsibilities include the deeply undignified task of waking up brothers who have dozed off mid-elimination. You witness this firsthand when Brother Marcus, a veteran of 15 years, simply doesn't return from his evening constitutional. The Circator finds him slumped over, snoring softly, his body having given up the fight against both constipation and consciousness. The gentle shake, the whispered, "Brother, you must return to your cell." The embarrassed shuffle back to the dormitory. It becomes a nightly ritual that strips away any remaining dignity the monastic life might have promised. The remedies are perhaps worse than the condition itself. You're introduced to a pharmacopoeia of medieval laxatives that would challenge the strongest stomach. Fruit extracts mixed with herbs that taste like punishment. Potions that smell like they've already been through someone's digestive system. And most memorably, the treatment that involves a small piece of soap, pressed and inserted rectally. You watch older monks prepare for this procedure with the same grim determination they bring to midnight prayers. And you wonder if this is what they mean by mortifying the flesh. You think about the modern world, where fiber supplements and proper hydration solve most digestive issues, where privacy is expected and medical treatment doesn't involve soap insertion. Here, your bowel movements become a community concern, monitored by the Circator, discussed by the infirmarian, and prayed over by the entire brotherhood. There's no privacy in suffering, no individual solutions to collective problems. The psychological impact is devastating. You find yourself timing your meals, your prayers, your work around the hope that today might be the day your body cooperates. You develop an intimate knowledge of every monk's digestive schedule, because in a community this small, everyone's business becomes everyone's business. The sounds from the privy building become a constant background noise, groaning, straining, the occasional cry of triumph or despair. Historians debate whether this widespread constipation was purely dietary or of stress, lack of exercise, and the general unhealthiness of monastic life contributed to the crisis. You feel all these factors in your own increasingly rebellious digestive system. The anxiety of constant surveillance, the physical strain of long hours hunched over manuscripts, the limited movement between prayer services, and the psychological pressure of trying to be holy while your body insists on being stubbornly, embarrassingly human. As you lie in your narrow bed, listening to the sounds of nocturnal digestive distress echoing from the privy building, you realize that this isn't just about physical discomfort. This is about the fundamental contradiction at the heart of monastic life. The attempt to transcend human limitations while being trapped in bodies that refuse to cooperate with spiritual ambitions. But if you think digestive disasters are the most humiliating aspect of monastery life, wait until you discover what happens when you're only allowed to bathe 4 times a year, and the odor of sanctity becomes a very real, very nauseating part of daily existence. You stand in what the monastery generously calls the lavatorium, a stone-walled chamber with a few basins and the kind of plumbing that would make a Roman engineer weep with despair. Today is one of the 4 blessed days of the year when you're actually required to bathe. The end of June, September, Easter, and Christmas. 4 times in an entire year. You do the math and realize that means roughly 90 days between each washing. 90 days of accumulated sweat, grime, lice droppings, and the general patina of medieval life, coating your skin like a second habit. The water is cold, not refreshingly cool, but bone, chillingly, teeth, chattering cold that makes you question whether this ritual is about cleanliness or simply another form of penance. You watch the other monks preparing for their quarterly ablutions with the same grim determination they bring to midnight prayers. Some strip down to reveal bodies that haven't seen soap in months, their skin bearing the telltale marks of constant scratching, the red welts of lice bites, and the general pallor of men who spend their lives indoors avoiding the sin of vanity. But here's where it gets truly medieval. Some of your fellow brothers aren't participating at all. Brother Augustine, who's been here for 20 years, stands fully clothed in the corner, explaining to anyone who will listen that he hasn't bathed in over a decade. This isn't neglect, it's devotion. He believes, along with several other particularly zealous monks, that washing the body is a form of pride, a concession to worldly vanity that distracts from spiritual purity. The dirtier you are, the holier you become. You learn that this twisted logic has a name, mortifying the flesh. The idea is that by denying your body basic comforts, including cleanliness, you're somehow purifying your soul. Medieval physicians like John Gadsden wrote extensively about how susceptible the clergy were to parasites, but rather than seeing this as a health crisis, the Church reframed it as a spiritual opportunity. The worse you smell, the more you're suffering, and the more you're suffering, the closer you are to God. The stench that rises from unwashed monks has its own theological term, the odor of sanctity. What would make a modern person gag is considered evidence of divine favor. You breathe through your mouth as you stand near Brother Augustine, whose personal aroma could probably be detected from the next county. The irony isn't lost on you that in a religion obsessed with purity of soul, physical filth has become a badge of honor. You think about Archbishop Thomas Becket, that paragon of medieval holiness, whose hair shirt was so infested with lice that witnesses described them as boiling over like water in a simmering cauldron, when they removed it after his martyrdom. Bishop Thomas Cantilupe's lice had to be scooped off by the handful during his final illness. These weren't failures of personal hygiene. They were proof of sanctity, evidence that these men had transcended worldly concerns about comfort and appearance. The psychological impact of this enforced filth is perhaps worse than the physical discomfort. You find yourself becoming nosed, blind to odors that would have horrified your former self. You stop noticing the way your skin itches constantly, the way your hair feels greasy and matted, the way your clothes stick to your body with accumulated sweat and grime. You're not just getting dirty, you're being systematically desensitized to basic human dignity. You watch the monks who do choose to bathe, and even they approach it with a kind of guilty reluctance, as if they're indulging in a shameful pleasure. The washing is perfunctory, efficient, joyless, more like a medical procedure than a cleansing ritual. There's no lingering, no enjoyment, no sense of refreshment. It's simply another obligation to be endured, another reminder that even basic human needs must be filtered through the lens of spiritual discipline. The contradiction is staggering when you think about it. This is a religion that preaches about the body being a temple, about treating yourself with respect as a creation of God, yet here you are, deliberately cultivating conditions that would be considered torture in any other context. You wonder how many modern people could psychologically adjust to this level of deliberate self-neglect, this systematic assault on basic human dignity. As you finally lower yourself into the frigid water, feeling months of accumulated grime slowly dissolving, you realize that this isn't really about cleanliness at all. It's about control over your body, your comfort, your very sense of self. The monastery doesn't just want your obedience, it wants to reshape your understanding of what it means to be human. But if you think the quarterly bathing ritual is the most psychologically challenging aspect of monastery life, wait until you discover what happens when Viking longships appear on the horizon and 40 terrified monks huddle in their chapel, praying desperately for protection from the fury of the Northmen. You jolt awake to the sound of the bell tolling frantically in the darkness, not the measured, peaceful chimes that call you to prayer, but the desperate, panicked clanging that means only one thing. Raiders have been spotted on the horizon. Your heart pounds as you stumble from your straw pallet, joining the other monks who are already rushing toward the chapel, their faces pale with terror in the flickering candlelight. This is the nightmare that haunts every monastery along the coast, the reason why your evening prayers now include a desperate plea that has become all too familiar. From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us. You huddle with your brothers in the stone chapel, listening to the abbot's trembling voice as he leads the prayer that every monk in England knows by heart. The Vikings have been terrorizing monasteries for over 50 years now, ever since that horrific day in 793 when they descended on Lindisfarne like wolves among sheep. You've heard the stories whispered in the dormitory how the raiders dragged monks from their cells, slaughtered them in the very sanctuary where they sought God's protection, and made off with treasures that had taken generations to accumulate. The irony isn't lost on you that monasteries, these supposed sanctuaries of peace and divine protection, have become prime targets for the most violent men of your age. The Vikings know exactly what they're looking for: gold chalices, silver reliquaries, illuminated manuscripts bound in precious metals, and most valuable of all, the monks themselves, who can be sold into slavery or ransomed back to their communities for enormous sums. Your life of poverty and devotion has made you, paradoxically, a valuable commodity in the most brutal marketplace imaginable. You think about Jarrow, attacked in 794, just 1 year after Lindisfarne, then Aina in 795. The pattern is always the same: longships appearing suddenly on the horizon, warriors pouring onto the beaches like a plague of locusts, and then the screaming, the burning, the systematic destruction of everything you hold sacred. Some monasteries have been hit multiple times, their communities scattered, their libraries destroyed, their very existence erased from the landscape. The psychological toll is perhaps worse than the physical danger. You can't sleep peacefully knowing that any night might bring the sound of splintering wood and foreign voices shouting in languages you don't understand. Every shadow could hide a raider. Every sound could be the prelude to massacre. The constant fear has transformed your community from a place of spiritual contemplation into something resembling a military outpost, with monks taking turns as sentries and emergency plans for hiding the most precious relics. You watch Brother Thomas, who survived the second raid on Lindisfarne, and see how his hands shake during prayers. He's told you about watching his fellow monks being dragged away in chains, about the smell of burning parchment as centuries of scholarship went up in flames, about the way the raiders laughed as they desecrated the altar. Some traumas, you realize, can't be healed by prayer alone, no matter how fervently you believe. The waiting is agony. Hours pass in the chapel, 40 monks pressed together in the darkness, listening for sounds that might herald your doom. Some pray silently, their lips moving in desperate supplication. Others weep openly, overwhelmed by the helplessness of their situation. You're supposed to trust in God's protection, but the evidence suggests that divine intervention isn't exactly reliable when it comes to Viking raids. You think about the modern world, where security systems and police forces provide at least the illusion of safety, where religious buildings aren't considered military targets, where the worst thing that might happen during evening prayers is someone's phone going off. Here, your devotion to God has made you a target, your commitment to peace has made you prey, and your vow of poverty means you have no resources to defend yourself. As dawn breaks without the appearance of longships, you feel a mixture of relief and exhaustion that's become all too familiar. The raiders may not have come today, but they'll be back, if not here, then at another monastery, bringing the same terror, the same destruction, the same reminder that in this violent age, even God's house isn't safe from human brutality. But if you think the constant fear of Viking raids is the most psychologically devastating aspect of monastery life, wait until you discover what happens when you're responsible for caring for the sick and dying with nothing but herbs, prayers, and the crushing weight of your own medical ignorance. You thought the daylight hours were challenging, but nothing could have prepared you for the unique horror of nighttime duties in the monastery. Tonight, you've been assigned to shadow Brother Marcus, the Circator, a position that sounds official and important until you discover what it actually entails. As the monastery settles into its supposed period of rest, you learn that someone must patrol the corridors, ensuring that no ungodly mischief takes place under cover of darkness. What you don't expect is that this noble sounding duty includes some of the most undignified tasks imaginable. You begin your rounds at midnight, just after compline, when the great silence is supposed to descend upon the monastery. The corridors are pitch black except for the occasional guttering candle, and every footstep echoes off the stone walls like a judgment. Brother Marcus moves with the practiced stealth of someone who's been doing this job for years, his sandaled feet making barely a whisper against the cold floor. You try to match his silence, but your novice clumsiness seems amplified in the darkness. The first stop is the dormitory, where you peer through the gloom at rows of sleeping monks. Some snore peacefully, exhausted from their daily labors. Others toss and turn, muttering prayers or crying out from nightmares. A few scratch constantly at their lice-infested scalps, even in sleep. Brother Marcus checks each bed methodically, ensuring that no one has wandered off for unauthorized midnight activities. You wonder what kind of mischief could possibly tempt men who have taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Then you discover the answer, and it's far more mundane and humiliating than any spiritual transgression you might have imagined. Your next destination is the 2-story privy building, where the real work of the Circator begins. The smell hits you before you even enter, a nauseating combination of human waste, damp stone, and the lingering effects of those medieval laxatives that never quite work as intended. This is where you learn that some of your fellow monks have developed the unfortunate habit of falling asleep on the toilets. Brother Marcus explains this phenomenon with the weary patience of someone who's dealt with it countless times. The combination of chronic constipation, exhaustion from the demanding monastic schedule, and the relative privacy of the privy creates the perfect conditions for monks to simply drift off. Some have been known to sleep for hours in these less than ideal circumstances, their bodies finally surrendering to fatigue even in the most uncomfortable positions imaginable. You watch in horrified fascination as Brother Marcus gently shakes Brother Augustine awake. The older monk startles, disoriented and embarrassed, mumbling apologies as he adjusts his habit and shuffles back toward the dormitory. This scene repeats itself twice more during your rounds. Grown men who have dedicated their lives to spiritual discipline, reduced to being roused from toilet, based slumber like children who have fallen asleep at their desks. The psychological impact of this duty is staggering. You realize that the Circator isn't just maintaining order, he's preserving what little dignity the monastic community has left. Without someone to wake these exhausted brothers, they might spend entire nights slumped over in the privy, vulnerable to both physical harm and profound humiliation. It's a job that requires both compassion and discretion, qualities that become essential when human dignity hangs by such a fragile thread. You think about the modern world, where privacy is expected and basic bodily functions don't require community supervision. Here, even your most private moments become subject to institutional oversight. The Circator's rounds represent the complete erosion of personal boundaries, the final surrender of individual autonomy to the collective needs of the monastery. There's nowhere to hide, no moment too intimate for potential intervention. As you continue your patrol, checking the Scriptorium for monks who might be secretly working by candlelight, inspecting the kitchen for unauthorized midnight snacking, and ensuring that no one has wandered into areas where they shouldn't be, you begin to understand the true nature of monastic surveillance. This isn't just about preventing sin. It's about maintaining a system where every aspect of human behavior is monitored, controlled, and corrected. The night stretches on endlessly. Your feet grow numb from walking on cold stone, your eyes strain from peering into dark corners, and your stomach churns from the various odors you encounter. Brother Marcus moves through it all with mechanical efficiency, a man who's long since stopped being surprised by the ways human nature asserts itself even in the most controlled environments. By dawn, you've witnessed 3 more toilet rescues, caught 1 monk attempting to hoard bread from dinner, and discovered another brother who'd fallen asleep while copying manuscripts, his face pressed into wet ink that will take hours to clean. Each incident is handled with the same quiet professionalism, the same understanding that these aren't moral failures, but simply the inevitable result of pushing human beings beyond their natural limits. But if you think the Circator's midnight rounds represent the most psychologically challenging aspect of monastery life, wait until you discover what happens when you're responsible for running a medieval hospital with nothing but herbs' prayers and the crushing weight of watching people die while you stand helplessly by. You push open the heavy wooden door to St. Leonard's Hospital, and the smell hits you immediately, a nauseating mixture of unwashed bodies, festering wounds, herbal concoctions, and the unmistakable stench of approaching death. This is where you'll spend your days as the monastery's infirmarian, tending to the sick, the dying, and the desperate souls who arrive at your gates seeking miracles that medieval medicine simply cannot provide. Welcome to the intersection of faith and futility, where your job is to heal bodies with tools that barely qualify as medicine. Brother Wolfston, the current infirmarian, greets you with eyes that have seen too much suffering and hands stained permanently with the blood and bodily fluids of countless patients. He's been doing this job for over a decade, and you can see the toll it's taken, not just physically, but spiritually. How do you maintain faith in divine healing when you watch people die despite your best efforts? How do you reconcile the promise of God's mercy with the reality of human agony that no amount of prayer seems to alleviate? Your medical training consists of whatever herbal knowledge you've picked up in the monastery gardens, a collection of remedies passed down through generations of well-meaning but medically ignorant monks, and an unshakable belief that spiritual healing must come before physical treatment. The first rule of medieval medicine is that every patient must confess their sins before receiving any medical attention, because obviously, illness is a punishment for moral failings, and you can't cure the body until you've cleansed the soul. You watch as a pilgrim is carried in on a makeshift stretcher, burning with fever and delirious with pain. Brother Wolfston immediately begins the spiritual diagnosis. What sins has this man committed to deserve such suffering? Has he confessed properly? Is his soul prepared for either healing or death? Only after these theological questions are addressed does anyone bother to examine the actual symptoms, and by then, precious time has been lost that might have made a difference. Your medical arsenal is pathetically limited. You have witch hazel for inflammation, mint tisane to induce sweating, ground gemstones that supposedly have healing properties, and various herbal concoctions that taste terrible and accomplish little. For serious conditions, you might try bloodletting, because medieval medicine is convinced that most illnesses are caused by an imbalance of bodily humors that can be corrected by draining the patient's blood. The irony that this treatment often weakens patients further is lost on most practitioners. You think about the modern world, where antibiotics can cure infections that would be death sentences in your time, where pain medication can provide relief that you can only offer through prayer, where diagnostic tools can identify problems that you can only guess at. Here, you're essentially practicing medicine blindfolded, with one hand tied behind your back, while being expected to produce miracles through sheer force of faith. The psychological burden of this work is crushing. You sit by bedsides, holding the hands of dying patients, offering comfort that feels increasingly hollow as you watch them slip away despite your best efforts. You pray desperately for divine intervention that rarely comes, and you begin to question whether your failures are due to insufficient faith, inadequate medical knowledge, or simply the cruel reality that some suffering cannot be alleviated by human means. Brother Wolfston tells you about the pilgrim who died last week, a soldier who'd been suffering from recurring fevers for 5 years, probably malaria contracted during military campaigns in France. You watched him deteriorate over several days, tried every remedy in your limited arsenal, prayed continuously for his recovery, and ultimately held his hand as he took his final breath. The helplessness you felt in that moment is something that haunts every medieval medical practitioner, the knowledge that you're essentially useless against most serious illnesses. The hospital becomes a theater of false hope and genuine despair. Families arrive expecting miracles, and you're forced to manage their expectations while maintaining your own sanity. Some patients do recover, usually those with minor ailments that would have healed on their own anyway, and these successes are celebrated as proof of divine intervention. But the failures, the deaths, the prolonged suffering that you can't alleviate, these weigh on your soul like stones. You learn to compartmentalize the grief, to focus on providing comfort rather than cures, to find meaning in easing suffering even when you can't eliminate it. But late at night, lying on your straw pallet after another day of medical futility, you wonder if this is really what God intended when He called you to serve others. Is bearing witness to suffering without being able to meaningfully address it really a form of holy work? Or is it just an elaborate exercise in learned helplessness? But if you think the medical helplessness of the hospital is the most psychologically devastating aspect of monastery life, wait until you discover what happens when you're forced to practice mortification of the flesh, deliberately inflicting pain on yourself as a path to spiritual enlightenment. You kneel in your cell at dawn, preparing for what Brother Augustine calls the daily offering, a ritual that would horrify anyone from the modern world, but which has become as routine as morning prayers in your monastic life. In your trembling hands you hold a discipline, a small whip made of knotted cords, and you're about to deliberately inflict pain on your own body as an act of spiritual devotion. Welcome to mortification of the flesh, the medieval practice of turning self-harm into a sacrament, where every welt and bruise becomes a prayer, every moment of agony a step closer to divine grace. The logic, if you can call it that, is both simple and terrifying. Christ suffered for humanity's sins, so you must suffer to share in His sacrifice. Your body is seen as the enemy of your soul, a source of temptation and weakness that must be beaten into submission. The more pain you can endure, the more you're proving your devotion to God and your rejection of worldly pleasures. It's a theology that transforms masochism into martyrdom, self-abuse into sanctification. You watch the older monks prepare for their morning discipline with the practiced efficiency of men who have been hurting themselves for decades. Brother Marcus strips to the waist, revealing a back crisscrossed with old scars and fresh wounds that never quite heal. He begins his ritual flogging with mechanical precision, each strike calculated to cause maximum pain without permanent damage. The sound echoes through the stone corridors, the whistle of cord through air, the wet slap of impact, the barely suppressed groans of men pushing themselves beyond the limits of human endurance. Some monks wear hair shirts, coarse garments woven from goat hair or embedded with small metal spikes that constantly irritate the skin. Brother Thomas has worn his for so long that it's become embedded in his flesh in places, the fabric fused with scar tissue in a grotesque marriage of clothing and skin. He speaks of it fondly, like a beloved pet, describing how it keeps him constantly aware of his spiritual obligations through its relentless discomfort. You think about the modern world, where self-harm is recognized as a mental health crisis requiring immediate intervention, where the deliberate infliction of pain is seen as a symptom of psychological distress rather than spiritual advancement. Here, it's not just encouraged, it's mandated. The monks who don't participate in mortification are viewed with suspicion, their commitment to the faith questioned, their spiritual progress deemed inadequate. The variety of self-inflicted torments is both creative and disturbing. Some monks sleep on beds of thorns, others wear chains around their waists that dig into flesh with every movement. Brother Augustine has developed an elaborate system of self-punishment that includes fasting until he faints, standing in freezing water for hours, and wearing shoes filled with pebbles that make every step an agony. He describes these practices with the enthusiasm of a craftsman discussing his tools, proud of his innovations in the art of holy suffering. The psychological impact is perhaps more devastating than the physical damage. You're being systematically trained to associate pain with virtue, suffering with salvation, self-destruction with spiritual growth. Every natural instinct for self-preservation must be overridden. Every impulse toward comfort must be crushed. You're not just mortifying your flesh, you're mortifying your humanity, piece by bloody piece. You learn that some monks have taken this practice to extremes that would challenge even the most dedicated masochist. Henry Suso, the Dominican mystic, wore an undergarment embedded with 150 brass nails, points turned inward, for 16 years. He also wore a chain-mail shirt and iron chains around his waist, and slept with his hands bound to prevent himself from scratching his wounds in his sleep. When he finally abandoned these practices, it was only because his confessor ordered him to stop, not because he recognized them as harmful. The monastery becomes a theater of competitive suffering, where monks try to outdo each other in their displays of holy masochism. You witness Brother Marcus attempting to sleep standing up for an entire week, Brother Thomas refusing to eat anything but bread and water for months, and Brother Augustine developing increasingly elaborate methods of self-torture that would make a medieval executioner proud. The line between devotion and mental illness becomes increasingly blurred. As you raise the discipline for your first strike, you feel a mixture of terror and anticipation that disturbs you more than the physical pain to come. You're beginning to understand that mortification doesn't just hurt your body, it rewires your brain, teaching you to find pleasure in pain, meaning in meaningless suffering, virtue in self-destruction. With each lash, you're not just marking your flesh, you're marking your soul with scars that may never heal. But if you think deliberate self-torture is the most psychologically damaging aspect of monastery life, wait until you discover what happens when you're forced to live under the rule of Saint Benedict, a system of total obedience that requires you to surrender not just your body, but your very will, to the absolute authority of others. You kneel before the abbot in the chapter house, surrounded by the entire monastic community, as he reads from the rule of Saint Benedict. The first degree of humility is obedience without delay. The words echo off the stone walls like a death sentence for your individual will, because that's exactly what they are. You're about to discover that the monastery doesn't just want your body, your comfort, or even your pain. It wants something far more precious and irreplaceable, your ability to think, choose, and act as an autonomous human being. The rule is explicit in its demands. You must consider yourself inferior to all, accept even the most degrading tasks without complaint, and obey your superiors instantly, completely, and without question. This isn't just about following orders. It's about the systematic dismantling of your personality, the deliberate erosion of everything that makes you uniquely yourself. You're being transformed from a person into a vessel, from an individual into an instrument of institutional will. You watch as Brother Marcus receives his daily assignment from the prior. He's to spend the entire day scrubbing the privy floors with his bare hands. A task so degrading that it would be considered punishment in any other context. But Marcus doesn't protest, doesn't even flinch. He simply bows his head and says, "Yes, Father, with the same tone he might use to accept a blessing. You realize with growing horror that this isn't submission, it's the complete absence of self, the successful eradication of human dignity through years of systematic conditioning. The psychological techniques are sophisticated and relentless. You're taught to second, guess every impulse, to distrust every desire, to view your own thoughts as potential sins requiring confession and correction. The phrase, "I am nothing," becomes a mantra that you're required to repeat throughout the day, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a statement of literal truth. You are nothing. Your opinions don't matter. Your preferences are irrelevant. Your will is an obstacle to be overcome. You think about the modern world, where individual autonomy is considered a fundamental human right, where the ability to make choices about your own life is seen as essential to mental health and human dignity. Here, choice is the enemy, autonomy is rebellion, and the very concept of personal preference is treated as a form of spiritual disease that must be cured through obedience. The monastery becomes a laboratory for human conditioning, where every aspect of behavior modification is employed to break down resistance and rebuild compliance. You're rewarded for self-negation and punished for self-assertion. You learn to anticipate orders before they're given, to suppress reactions before they form, to become so attuned to the will of others that your own will simply withers away from disuse. Brother Augustine, who's been here for 20 years, has achieved what the monastery considers perfect obedience. He moves through his days like a sleepwalker, responding to commands with mechanical precision, but showing no spark of individual thought or feeling. When you try to engage him in conversation, his responses are limited to approved phrases and theological platitudes. You wonder if there's still a person inside that shell, or if the conditioning has been so complete that the original Augustine has simply ceased to exist. The most disturbing aspect isn't the obedience itself, it's how quickly you begin to find comfort in it. Making decisions is exhausting, taking responsibility is frightening, and there's a seductive peace in surrendering all agency to others. You start to understand why some monks never leave, even when given the opportunity. The outside world, with its demands for independent thought and personal responsibility, becomes terrifying to people who have been systematically trained to be helpless. You learn that questioning orders, even silently, is considered a sin requiring confession. Hesitating before obeying is a mark of spiritual weakness. Showing any sign of personal preference or individual thought is evidence of pride, the deadliest of sins. You're being taught that your humanity itself is the problem, that everything that makes you a unique individual is an obstacle to salvation that must be systematically removed. The rule of Saint Benedict isn't just a set of guidelines, it's a manual for psychological dismantling, a step-by-step process for transforming human beings into perfectly compliant instruments of institutional will. You realize that you're not just losing your freedom, you're losing your capacity to even want freedom, your ability to imagine alternatives, your very sense of self as something worth preserving. As you lie on your straw pallet that night, you try to remember who you were before you entered this place, but the memories feel distant and unreal, like stories about someone else. You wonder if this is what they mean by dying to the world, not a metaphorical death, but the literal extinction of everything that once made you human. But if you think the systematic destruction of individual will is the most psychologically devastating aspect of monastery life, wait until you discover what happens when you're forced to confront the ultimate contradiction, living in poverty while surrounded by unimaginable wealth. You stand in the great hall of St. Mary's Abbey, surrounded by wealth that would make a king envious, and the contradiction hits you like a physical blow. Golden chalices gleam on marble altars, illuminated manuscripts bound in silver rest on carved wooden lecterns, and tapestries worth more than entire villages hang from stone walls that cost fortunes to build. Yet you, sworn to poverty, own nothing, not even the threadbare habit on your back. Welcome to the ultimate paradox of monastic life, living in deliberate destitution while being surrounded by unimaginable riches. The abbey's annual income exceeds £2,000, a sum so vast that it rivals the treasuries of entire kingdoms. You learn that St. Mary's is one of the wealthiest religious institutions in England, its coffers filled through centuries of donations, land grants, and the systematic exploitation of peasant labor. The irony isn't lost on you that this monument to spiritual poverty was built on the backs of people who actually lived in the material poverty you're only pretending to embrace. You watch as Abbot Thomas de Moulton conducts business with merchants, nobles, and political figures who treat him not as a humble servant of God, but as one of the most powerful men in the realm. His influence rivals that of the Archbishop of York. His word can make or break political careers, and his wealth can fund armies or topple governments. Yet this same man preaches to you daily about the spiritual dangers of material attachment, the virtue of want, and the holiness of having nothing. The monastery employs an army of servants, craftsmen, and laborers who maintain this elaborate facade of holy poverty. You see them every day, the bakers, brewers, gardeners, and builders, whose actual labor creates the wealth that allows you to pretend you're living without worldly possessions. These people work for wages that barely keep them alive, while you enjoy the fruits of their labor in the name of spiritual discipline. The hypocrisy is so blatant it takes your breath away. You think about the modern world, where such wealth inequality would spark outrage, where the gap between stated values and actual behavior would be called out as fraud. Here it's not just accepted, it's celebrated as evidence of God's favor. The richer the monastery, the more blessed it must be. The more the monks suffer in their individual poverty, the more virtuous they become. It's a system that transforms exploitation into sanctification, inequality into divine will. The psychological impact of living within this contradiction is devastating. You're constantly reminded that you own nothing while being surrounded by everything. You sleep on straw while golden reliquaries worth fortunes sit mere feet away. You eat simple bread while the abbey's kitchens prepare elaborate feasts for visiting dignitaries. You wear rough wool while silk vestments hang in the sacristy, waiting for special occasions when the monastery needs to display its wealth and power. Brother Augustine, who's been here for 20 years, has developed what can only be described as cognitive dissonance on an industrial scale. He speaks passionately about the virtue of poverty while polishing silver candlesticks worth more than most people will see in their lifetimes. He describes the spiritual benefits of want while living in a building that represents more accumulated wealth than entire cities. You wonder if he's genuinely deluded, or if this is simply what happens when human psychology is pushed beyond its breaking point. The monastery becomes a theater of performed poverty, where monks play at being destitute while being supported by vast institutional wealth. You learn to speak of holy poverty while eating food grown on abbey lands by abbey serfs, to praise detachment from worldly goods while wearing clothes made in abbey workshops by abbey craftsmen, to celebrate spiritual simplicity while living in buildings decorated with art treasures that would make Renaissance princes weep with envy. You realize that the monastery isn't just a contradiction, it's a carefully constructed lie that requires constant mental gymnastics to maintain. The monks aren't really poor. They're wealthy men who have outsourced the management of their wealth to an institution that allows them to enjoy its benefits while claiming spiritual credit for rejecting it. It's poverty as performance art, want as theater, suffering as luxury that only the rich can afford. The walls that were supposed to protect you from the corrupting influence of worldly wealth have instead trapped you inside the most elaborate monument to material excess you've ever seen. You're not escaping the world's obsession with money and power. You're living at its very epicenter, surrounded by more concentrated wealth than most people could imagine, while being forced to pretend it doesn't exist. But if you think the hypocrisy of performed poverty is the most psychologically damaging aspect of monastery life, wait until you discover what happens when the very rules meant to guide your spiritual development become tools for the systematic destruction of human dignity and individual worth. You kneel in the chapel at midnight for matins, surrounded by 40 other monks whose faces are barely visible in the flickering candlelight, and you realize that this moment, this shared ritual of exhaustion, devotion, and barely suppressed despair, might be the closest thing to genuine human connection you will experience in this place. The irony isn't lost on you that in a community supposedly built on brotherhood and mutual support, the deepest bonds are forged not through joy or celebration, but through the collective endurance of suffering that would break most people if they faced it alone. The silence between you and your fellow monks isn't the peaceful quiet of meditation. It's the heavy quiet of men who have learned that speaking about their pain only makes it worse. You see it in Brother Marcus's trembling hands as he holds his prayer book, in Brother Augustine's hollow eyes that never quite focus on anything, in the way Brother Thomas unconsciously scratches at his lice-infested scalp while reciting psalms. These aren't just individual struggles, they're shared wounds that bind you together in ways that normal human relationships never could. You begin to understand that the monastery's greatest achievement isn't the creation of holy men. It's the creation of a community that can function despite being systematically broken. Every monk here has been stripped of his individual identity, subjected to physical and psychological torments that would be considered torture in any other context, and forced to find meaning in meaninglessness. Yet somehow you've all learned to survive together, to find comfort in shared misery, to create a form of brotherhood based on mutual endurance rather than mutual affection. The daily routine becomes a form of collective meditation on suffering. You wake together at midnight, stumble together through the cold corridors, kneel together on stone floors that seem designed to cause maximum discomfort. When Brother Matthew falls asleep during prayers and gets hit with a stick, you all flinch together. When someone collapses from exhaustion during manual labor, you all feel the weight of your own fatigue more acutely. The monastery has created a community where individual pain becomes communal experience, where personal struggle becomes shared identity. You think about the modern world, where support groups and therapy sessions try to create the kind of deep understanding that comes naturally here through shared trauma. The difference is that those modern communities are built around healing and recovery, while this one is built around the acceptance that suffering is permanent, that endurance is the highest virtue, and that the only way to survive is to stop expecting things to get better. The unspoken communication between monks becomes its own language. A slight nod when someone is struggling with a particularly difficult task. A gentle touch on the shoulder when exhaustion threatens to overwhelm. The way Brother Augustine quietly takes on extra duties when Brother Marcus is too sick to work. These aren't grand gestures of friendship. They're small acts of recognition between people who understand each other's pain because they're living through identical experiences. You watch as the older monks, those who have been here for decades, move through their days with a kind of synchronized resignation that's both beautiful and terrifying. They've achieved something that might be called peace, but it's the peace of people who have stopped fighting, who have accepted that this is their life and that resistance only makes it worse. They've found brotherhood in surrender, community in collective defeat, love in shared hopelessness. The monastery becomes a laboratory for human bonding under extreme conditions. You learn that people can form deep connections not just through shared joy or common interests, but through shared endurance of the seemingly unendurable. The monk sleeping next to you becomes precious not because you like him, but because he's surviving the same nightmare you are. His continued existence is proof that survival is possible, that you're not alone in your struggle to maintain some vestige of humanity in an inhuman system. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this brotherhood is how it makes the suffering bearable. The community doesn't exist to help you escape the monastery's cruelties. It exists to help you accept them. Your fellow monks don't encourage rebellion or resistance. They model submission and endurance. The brotherhood becomes another tool of the institution, a way of making the unbearable seem normal, the abnormal seem holy, the destructive seem redemptive. As you file out of the chapel after matins, moving in perfect silence through corridors you could navigate blindfolded, you realize that you've become part of something larger than yourself, not a community of free individuals choosing to work together, but a collective organism designed to survive conditions that would destroy any single person. You've found brotherhood, but it's the brotherhood of prisoners, the solidarity of the systematically broken. the love that grows in the soil of shared despair. But if you think this community of endurance represents the final stage of your monastic transformation, wait until you discover what happens when you're forced to confront the ultimate question. After years of systematic dehumanization, is there anything left of the person you used to be, or have you become something else entirely?
You stand in the chapter house as the prior reads from the rule of Saint Benedict, his voice echoing off stone walls that seem to close in around you with each word. The monk must not only speak humbly, but also show humility in his bearing, keeping his eyes fixed on the ground. This isn't just guidance, it's a blueprint for the systematic dismantling of human dignity, a manual for transforming autonomous individuals into perfectly compliant instruments of institutional will. You're about to discover that the monastery's greatest achievement isn't creating holy men, but creating a system so psychologically sophisticated that its victims eventually become its most enthusiastic enforcers. The rule is explicit in its demands for what it calls the 12 degrees of humility, each one designed to strip away another layer of your humanity. You must consider yourself inferior to all, accept the most degrading tasks without complaint, and most devastatingly learn to find joy in your own humiliation. The text actually instructs you to be content with the meanest and worst of everything, and to approach even the most unreasonable commands as if they came from God himself. You realize with growing horror that this isn't just about obedience, it's about rewiring your brain to find pleasure in your own destruction. You watch as Brother Augustine demonstrates what the rule calls perfect obedience. When ordered to scrub the privy floors with his bare hands, he doesn't just comply, he thanks the prior for the opportunity to serve. When assigned to fast for 3 days while doing heavy manual labor, he expresses gratitude for the chance to mortify his flesh. When publicly humiliated for a minor infraction, he prostrates himself and begs for more punishment. This isn't submission, it's the complete psychological transformation of a human being into something else entirely. The monastery has perfected what modern psychologists would recognize as a comprehensive program of behavioral modification. Every natural human instinct is identified as sinful and systematically suppressed. Pride, anger, curiosity, sexual desire, even basic self-preservation, all are reframed as obstacles to salvation that must be eliminated through constant vigilance and self-correction. You're not just changing your behavior, you're changing your fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. You think about the modern world where such systematic psychological manipulation would be recognized as abuse, where the deliberate destruction of individual identity would be considered a crime against human dignity. Here, it's not just legal, it's holy. The more completely you surrender your autonomy, the more virtuous you become. The more thoroughly you destroy your sense of self, the closer you get to God. It's a theology that makes victimization into virtue, trauma into transcendence. The rule's genius lies in its comprehensiveness. It doesn't just control your actions, it controls your thoughts, your emotions, your very sense of reality. You're taught to distrust your own perceptions, to second, guess your own feelings, to view your own desires as evidence of spiritual failure. The monastery becomes a closed system where questioning the system itself is proof that the system is working. Your resistance is just more evidence of your need for correction. Brother Marcus, who's been here for 25 years, has achieved what the rule calls perfect stability. He moves through his days with the mechanical precision of a well-programmed machine, responding to commands with instant compliance, showing no trace of individual thought or preference. When you try to engage him in conversation about his life before the monastery, he looks at you with genuine confusion, as if you're asking about someone else's memories. The person he used to be has been so thoroughly erased that even he can't remember who that was. The psychological techniques are sophisticated and relentless. You're rewarded for self-negation and punished for self-assertion. You learn to anticipate orders before they are given, to suppress reactions before they form, to become so attuned to the will of others that your own will simply withers away from disuse. The monastery doesn't just want your obedience, it wants to make you incapable of disobedience, to transform you into someone who literally cannot conceive of alternatives. You realize that the rule of Saint Benedict isn't just a religious text, it's a manual for psychological warfare, a step-by-step guide for breaking down human resistance and rebuilding compliance. Every chapter, every verse, every instruction is designed to chip away at your sense of self until nothing remains but an empty vessel ready to be filled with institutional purpose. You're not becoming a better person, you're becoming a different species entirely. As you kneel in your cell that night, reciting the prescribed prayers of self-abasement, you try to remember who you were before you entered this place, but the memories feel distant and unreal, like stories about someone else. You wonder if this is what they mean by dying to the world, not a metaphorical death, but the literal extinction of everything that once made you human, leaving behind only a hollow shell that responds to commands with perfect, mindless obedience. But if you think the systematic destruction of individual will represents the final stage of monastic transformation, wait until you discover what happens when you realize that after years of this conditioning, you can no longer imagine any other way to live, and worse, you no longer want to. You stand in the great hall of St. Mary S. Abbey, surrounded by wealth that would make a king. Envious, and the contradiction hits you like a physical blow. Golden chalices gleam on marble altars, illuminated manuscripts bound in silver rest on carved wooden lecterns, and tapestries worth more than entire villages hang from stone walls that cost fortunes to build. Yet you, sworn to poverty, own nothing, not even the threadbare habit on your back. Welcome to the ultimate paradox of monastic life, living in deliberate destitution while being surrounded by unimaginable riches. The abbey's annual income exceeds £2,000, a sum so vast that it rivals the treasuries of entire kingdoms. You learn that St. Mary's is one of the wealthiest religious institutions in England. Its coffers filled through centuries of donations, land grants, and the systematic exploitation of peasant labor. The irony isn't lost on you that this monument to spiritual poverty was built on the backs of people who actually lived in the material poverty you're only pretending to embrace. You watch as Abbot Thomas de Moulton conducts business with merchants, nobles, and political figures who treat him not as a humble servant of God, but as one of the most powerful men in the realm. His influence rivals that of the Archbishop of York. His word can make or break political careers, and his wealth can fund armies or topple governments. Yet this same man preaches to you daily about the spiritual dangers of material attachment, the virtue of want, and the holiness of having nothing. The monastery employs an army of servants, craftsmen, and laborers who maintain this elaborate facade of holy poverty. You see them every day, the bakers, brewers, gardeners, and builders whose actual labor creates the wealth that allows you to pretend you're living without worldly possessions. These people work for wages that barely keep them alive, while you enjoy the fruits of their labor in the name of spiritual discipline. The hypocrisy is so blatant it takes your breath away. You think about the modern world, where such wealth inequality would spark outrage, where the gap between stated values and actual behavior would be called out as fraud. Here, it's not just accepted, it's celebrated as evidence of God's favor. The richer the monastery, the more blessed it must be. The more the monks suffer in their individual poverty, the more virtuous they become. It's a system that transforms exploitation into sanctification, inequality into divine will. The psychological impact of living within this contradiction is devastating. You're constantly reminded that you own nothing while being surrounded by everything. You sleep on straw while golden reliquaries worth fortunes sit mere feet away. You eat simple bread while the abbey's kitchens prepare elaborate feasts for visiting dignitaries. You wear rough wool while silk vestments hang in the sacristy, waiting for special occasions when the monastery needs to display its wealth and power. Brother Augustine, who's been here for 20 years, has developed what can only be described as cognitive dissonance on an industrial scale. He speaks passionately about the virtue of poverty while polishing silver candlesticks, worth more than most people will see in their lifetimes. He describes the spiritual benefits of want while living in a building that represents more accumulated wealth than entire cities. You wonder if he's genuinely deluded, or if this is simply what happens when human psychology is pushed beyond its breaking point. The monastery becomes a theater of performed poverty, where monks play at being destitute while being supported by vast institutional wealth. You learn to speak of holy poverty while eating food grown on abbey lands by abbey serfs, to praise detachment from worldly goods while wearing clothes made in abbey workshops by abbey craftsmen, to celebrate spiritual simplicity while living in buildings decorated with art treasures that would make Renaissance princes weep with envy. You realize that the monastery isn't just a contradiction, it's a carefully constructed lie that requires constant mental gymnastics to maintain. The monks aren't really poor. They're wealthy men who have outsourced the management of their wealth to an institution that allows them to enjoy its benefits while claiming spiritual credit for rejecting it. It's poverty as performance art, want as theater, suffering as luxury that only the rich can afford. The walls that were supposed to protect you from the corrupting influence of worldly wealth have instead trapped you inside the most elaborate monument to material excess you've ever seen. You're not escaping the world's obsession with money and power. You're living at its very epicenter, surrounded by more concentrated wealth than most people could imagine, while being forced to pretend it doesn't exist. As you kneel in your cell that night, trying to reconcile the day's contradictions, you begin to understand that the monastery's greatest achievement isn't spiritual enlightenment. It's the creation of a system so psychologically sophisticated that it can make people grateful for their own exploitation, content with their own dehumanization, and proud of their own systematic destruction. You've found sanctuary, but it's the sanctuary of the perfectly broken, the completely compliant, the utterly defeated. But if you think the hypocrisy of performed poverty represents the final revelation about monastic life, wait until you discover what happens when you realize that after years of this conditioning, the monastery hasn't just changed how you think, it's changed who you are at the most fundamental level, and there may be no way back to the person you used to be.
You kneel in the chapel one final time as the bell tolls for compline, and you realize with a mixture of horror and acceptance that you can no longer remember what it felt like to want anything for yourself. The person who entered this monastery years ago with dreams, preferences, desires, and a sense of individual worth has been so thoroughly erased that even the memory of having those things feels like a story about someone else. You've achieved what the monastery considers perfect spiritual development, the complete absence of self, the total surrender of will, the absolute transformation from human being into holy instrument. The monastery has succeeded beyond its wildest ambitions. You don't just obey orders, you anticipate them. You don't just accept suffering, you seek it out. You don't just suppress your desires, you've forgotten how to have them. When Brother Augustine assigns you to scrub the privy floors with your bare hands, you feel genuine gratitude for the opportunity to debase yourself. When you're denied food for 3 days while doing heavy labor, you thank God for the chance to mortify your flesh. When you're publicly humiliated for imaginary infractions, you prostrate yourself and beg for more punishment. You think about the modern world, where such complete psychological transformation would be recognized as the result of systematic abuse, where the deliberate destruction of individual identity would be considered a crime against human dignity. But those thoughts feel distant and academic, like studying the customs of a foreign culture that has nothing to do with your reality. You've been so thoroughly conditioned that you can no longer conceive of alternatives, can no longer imagine wanting to be anywhere else or anyone else. The other monks move around you like fellow survivors of some cosmic shipwreck, each one as thoroughly broken and rebuilt as you are. Brother Marcus, who's been here for 30 years, has achieved a kind of mechanical perfection that's both inspiring and terrifying. He responds to commands with instant compliance, shows no trace of individual thought or preference, and speaks only in approved phrases and theological platitudes. You aspire to his level of complete surrender, his total absence of self. You realize that what the monastery calls finding God is actually the process of losing yourself so completely that there's nothing left but an empty vessel ready to be filled with institutional purpose. The spiritual journey isn't about becoming a better person, it's about ceasing to be a person at all. You've found peace, but it's the peace of the completely defeated, the utterly compliant, the perfectly broken. The daily routine that once felt like torture now feels like the natural rhythm of existence. You wake at midnight for matins not because you have to, but because you can't imagine doing anything else. You mortify your flesh not because it's required, but because the idea of comfort has become foreign to you. You obey without question not because you fear punishment, but because the concept of having your own will has simply ceased to exist. You understand now that endurance isn't just about surviving hardship, it's about being transformed by it so completely that you become something else entirely. The monastery doesn't just test your ability to endure suffering, it uses that suffering to reshape you at the most fundamental level, to rewire your brain, to reconstruct your very understanding of what it means to exist. As you file out of the chapel after compline, moving in perfect silence through corridors you could navigate blindfolded, you feel a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of a journey towards something better, but the completion of a process of systematic destruction and reconstruction. You've been broken down and rebuilt according to specifications that prioritize institutional needs over individual humanity. The monastery walls no longer feel like a prison because you no longer remember what freedom felt like. They don't feel like a sanctuary because you no longer need protection from a world you can barely remember. They simply feel like the natural boundaries of existence, the only reality you can conceive of, the only life you can imagine wanting. You drift off to sleep on your straw pallet, not to dreams of escape or memories of your former life, but to the dreamless sleep of someone who has achieved what the monastery considers the highest spiritual state, the complete absence of self, the total surrender of will, the perfect transformation from human being into holy instrument. You've found meaning in suffering by allowing suffering to erase everything that once made you capable of meaning anything at all. Tomorrow will bring another day of prayers, labor, and obedience, but it won't feel like endurance anymore. It will feel like the natural order of things, the only way life could possibly be, the inevitable result of a process that has transformed you from someone who suffered into someone who exists only to serve the institution that destroyed and remade you.